Good afternoon and welcome, at least online, to Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage State Historic Sites. We are excited to have Dr. Scott Zukowski with us this afternoon to discuss his paper on government in petticoats, gender poetics in New Jersey's newspaper literature from 1789 to 1807. The Old Dutch Parsonage was home to two delegates to the Provincial Congress of New Jersey, which in 1776 adopted the Constitution that included a unique clause allowing, at least in some cases, women and free people of color to vote. And Dr. Zukowski explores, well, that's what it means on a political level, on a legal level. He's going to give us a look at what it meant on the popular level. What did people actually think about this? And how they expressed it in this era is through the popular literature that the newspapers carried. This paper is published in New Jersey Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, and is an award-winning paper from the New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance, and was presented at the New Jersey Historical Commission's New Jersey History Conference in 2019. So thanks a lot. And again, just for housekeeping, please keep your microphones off. And if you don't want to be on the recording, please also keep your cameras off. And but if you have questions to ask, please do in the chat feature. Thanks so much. And this is made possible by the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association with a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. And let's get started. Scott, go ahead.
Paul, thank you so much. Everybody, I want to thank Paul for just going to the ends of the earth to make sure that this would actually run. Is this a sign of our times or what? That of course there's a technical glitch that happens. So thank you, Paul, who even before this, you've done so much to put this event together. I also want to thank all the folks at the Old Dutch Parsonage and Wallace House for hosting this event, and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their additional support. And let me just set a timer here since we're a little bit behind now. Really, thank all of you. As I watched all of you trickle into this new deep backup meeting, I'm really thinking, wow, it's spring. It looks like it stopped raining in the tri-state area. We've been locked up all winter. We're 20 minutes behind and they're still here. So thank you. And I'll also say, I genuinely think that your attendance here suggests something of your values. This is a talk on women's rights, on voting rights, and therefore on an area of American history that's important for us to think about today. We're at a landmark moment in American history in terms of voting rights, voting access, and of course, voter suppression. And if there's time at the end, I'd be especially interested to hear audience members' questions about my talk, of course, and also to hear your thoughts connecting this talk to current events. So, Paul, at a great risk right now, I'm going to share. How does that look, folks? Paul, can you give me a confirmation that my title page is up?
Yes, that looks good.
All right, excellent. To give a general idea of what's ahead, I'm going to talk about how the poems and literature written by everyday people and shared and published in local New Jersey newspapers from 1789 to 1807, how these poems and writings reveal tension and anxiety surrounding women's rights, women's voting, and women's role in the family and society. A key part of what I want to demonstrate is that the poetry, fiction, witticisms, dialogues, and all these other genres of creative literature in New Jersey newspapers did reflect some social progress, but they also created a sort of extra-legal set of gendered norms. And if not created, then at least really reinforced. So the conservative texts especially reminded New Jersey citizens of what was considered appropriate or not appropriate for its female residents. In this way, periodical literature about women most often expressed apprehensions about how to define and control gender And through that literature's printing, reprinting, and circulation, I suggest that it did influence its readers' social and political views on women. Now I'm going to come back and stop sharing. So I hope you can see me again. To start, I want to give a little bit of background information on how I arrived at this project. Like many of you, I didn't always know that New Jersey women had the right to vote from 1776 to 1807. And I say New Jersey women, but as we'll discuss more later, it was really that some but not all New Jersey women had the right to vote, and some but not all of those who had the right actually used it. When I learned about early New Jersey women's suffrage, I was amazed. I immediately wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn everything there was to know about this. I read everything I could about it. And while I was doing all this research, I noticed that most scholars who talked about social responses to the women's vote concentrated on essayistic prose, on newspaper articles, letters, opinion pieces. A very small handful briefly noted some of the creative literature found in New Jersey newspapers. But on the whole, this was done more in passing or as an aside. So this really excited me. My dissertation analyzed the way that different groups in the colonies and early US expressed their relationship to British and American promises of liberty, equality, and justice through newspaper literature. And newspaper literature, of course, to me, provides a more ground level perspective rather than reading the famous texts and treatises written by wealthy elites. So pretty quickly, I decided that this would be my next dissertation chapter, an examination of gendered poetry in New Jersey newspapers during an era when many of the state's women there were legally able to vote, and in the era following the US's long and grueling war fought on the principles and rhetoric of equality, rights, liberty, opposition to tyranny. So I want to start with a quote that some of you may be familiar with and some of you may be seeing for the first time. If you're seeing it for the first time, I hope it excites you the same way that it excited me the first time I came across it. It's a letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams, written on March 31st, 1776, just over 3 months before the Declaration of Independence would be signed. And of course, Adams would assist in drafting the Declaration of Independence. And of course, he would go on to be president after that, decades later. In her letter, Abigail Adams points out the hypocrisy of an emerging nation rebelling for equality, liberty, rights, and representation, while not at all considering that it keeps its women and others, of course, subjugated. So I'm going to share my screen again. And I'll read this out for, well, we need to go to the next slide, of course. Okay, we're still here. I don't know what happened, but I was kicked out for a second. Can you see, Paul, can you confirm that you can see my slide on the screen?
Yes, Abigail Adams to John Adams letter, March 31st.
Perfect. And so I'll read this out to you. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. Yes, I'm glad to hear a laugh in the background. I mean, this is pretty amazing stuff coming from the wife of one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence. And there are three main points to take away here. First, women's rights clearly were an issue in 1776. And we know that the founders were aware of this conversation, but they chose to disregard it. That's the first takeaway. Second takeaway, Abigail Adams, like many women, framed her plea in terms of revolutionary language. She talks about tyrants, rebellion, representation. This is language connected to America's war for independence, language that should have made the founding fathers think twice about how they designed their new system. And third, Abigail Adams identifies women's rights not just as a larger society issue, but also as an issue in the family and home as well. Husbands too often have unlimited power. This will be especially important for the literature that I'm going to talk about, which often expresses gendered anxiety about greater public society, but also anxieties about gender in the private family home setting. So briefly, something I know you're all familiar with, here is how the Declaration of Independence finally was published. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, the use of the word men can be interpreted different ways, and these lines quickly became the basis for many marginalized groups to attempt to claim equality and justice in the US. And so this is July 4th, 1776. If we can just jump back 2 days to July 2nd, 1776, here is the New Jersey State Constitution. And I'll read this out to you as well. This is the provision for voting rights. 4, that all inhabitants of this colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds proclamation money clear estate in the same, and have resided within the county in which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election, shall be entitled to vote for representatives in council and assembly, and also for all other public officers that shall be elected by the people of the county at large. So quickly, I will say 3 main takeaways here as well. First, there is no mention of sex or race, just inhabitants. And it's important to note several other state constitutions written the same year used explicit language. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina used the term freeman. Vermont used the term man. Georgia used the phrase white male inhabitants. And South Carolina used the phrase free white man. The second takeaway is that the law still only allows women owning a certain amount of property to vote, which basically excludes married women, since in most cases their property became their husband's property upon marriage. And third is that the wording here is intentional. Scholars have examined earlier drafts of the New Jersey Constitution and pretty solidly concluded that it must have been a deliberate decision to write the laws as such. And in fact, in 1790, voting laws for 7 New Jersey counties would use the inclusive phrasing he or she, and that was extended to all New Jersey counties in 1797. So these 2 modifications were what really, the explicit he or she, is what really fueled great increases in women's voting in New Jersey. So we've set the scene. Now let's get into some literature. I want to start with some of the publications found in the New Jersey Journal and Political Intelligencer, a newspaper, in 1789, before the unfolding of the French Revolution and its radical ideologies about equality, and before Mary Wollstonecraft's 1792 Vindication for the Rights of Women influenced the American scene. In the entire year of 1789, the New Jersey Journal printed 14 literary texts relating in any way to women. You might be thinking, well, how does he know this? I read through every single piece of every single issue of virtually all these newspapers and counted. And even at this early point, the sentiments within these texts are mixed. They're not completely progressive or conservative. One poem celebrates women's contributions to the Revolutionary War. Several texts are cautionary tales against improper behavior and the dangers of duplicitous men. Several celebrate bachelorhood, and several provide marital advice. The excerpt about women in the Revolution tells of the zeal of women, the zeal that women felt in their country's cause at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and it celebrates their commendable fundraising, which allowed them to create a suit of colors for the local military outfit. The women's actions are notably public, notably male, and this is reaffirmed when that excerpt notes that the gentlewoman who was appointed by others to present in their name to the regiment made a very gallant and spirited speech on that occasion and charged the officers and soldiers never to desert the colors of the ladies if they ever wished that the ladies should list under their banners. So the excerpt's focused attention on the women here is unique for the New Jersey Journal and Intelligencer, an Intelligencer. And the language is assertive. A gentlewoman gives an admirable public speech and charges, literally charges, not just men, but officers and soldiers to be courageous in battle. And furthermore, she intimates, however jokingly, a threat that their women will in some way disown them or deny them sexually if they fail. There's no indication of who submitted the excerpt for publication, but whoever it was, it appears that he or she supported such behavior by women. Yet, for each of the New Jersey Journal's 1789 texts that seem to celebrate or advocate for an expansion of women's spheres and rights, there appears a text that criticizes the same. In one poem entitled The Bachelor, the speaker describes all the joys of his peaceful life and concludes, "I live in harmony and free from strife, for I'm not blessed, good heaven, with a wife." I pause here just thinking, this is, of course, a strain of comedy that, or socializing that is still familiar to us today. But I will say, well, I'll get to its prevalence in the 1790s and its increase. This poem is just one in a long tradition of jokes, poems, and witticisms that employ the trope of the nagging wife for comedic effect and male-to-male bonding. In another 1789 issue, a matrimonial anecdote tells about a prostitute who tricks a lord into marrying her, thus illuminating the deceitful arts of women. These two texts reflect a male anxiety over marriage, and in both, that anxiety stems from concerns over economics and power. In the former, the speaker's wealth and power are key to his happiness. He says, "My servants wait, obedient at my hand, and cheerfully execute the mild command." While in the latter, it is somebody from the bottom rung of society who upends the Lord by gaining access to his wealth and exerting her powerful charms over him. These pieces both reflect and contribute to a male anxiety over female encroachment in the private male universe. Social tensions are also evident in some of the newspaper's other poems that provide sober advice to women on the process of courting and marriage. In A Maiden's Choice of a Husband, young women are urged to seek a virtuous husband who is genteel, noble, generous, learned, and still entertaining, engaging, and new. The poem closes with the condition, and this is important, that he be never tyrannical, but ever true. The contrast between this poem and the ones just described is pretty striking. The male perspective dreads the usurpation of male power by the female, and it does so based on a caricature of the antagonistic wife. But the female perspective identifies a husband's virtue as the utmost priority. The political rhetoric of tyranny and executed commands reflects the tension of power inherent in late 18th century American society, power that male forces wish to preserve, and power that female forces seek to balance out. On April 11th, 1792, let's make sure we are where we should be, a poet self-identified as a phoenix hunter published his poem, The Choice of a Wife. The speaker explains that he, quote, longs for honey. Here we are. He longs for honey and all the sweets of matrimony, but is cautious about his selection of a wife. But as I won't run helter-skelter, I wish to bargain for my halter. I'm going to pause here. Just this morning, as I was reading over this and reading it out loud, actually, I realized those aren't perfect rhymes. And I didn't realize this. I mean, I found this poem years ago. I literally didn't realize this until this morning, that there might be a literary analysis to be made that this speaker kind of looks like a bad poet. He kind of looks stupid by not having perfect rhymes twice in a row here. He's at least showing himself to not be the most skilled of a poet. So maybe that's a comment on what he's saying. In any case, that's to be sorted out later. The period's attitudes toward marriage and gender are clear. Matrimony brings sexual delights, but at the sacrifice of a male's individual liberty. To taste the pleasures of marriage, the male must agree to wear a halter or a noose for restraining an animal or hanging a person. While the man's sexual interest is evident in his longing for honey and sweets, he demands that his wife be virtuous and no forward minx who is intent to see and to be seen. In other words, he desires a wife who is sexual, but according to his own authority. The coquettishness of a minx and her desire to see and to be seen, a public thing, emasculates his power. They suggest a female agency that operates in the public sphere. This concern is reiterated in his stipulation that she not have a giggling air and a tongue that an inch or two might spare. Speech, we are reminded, is a powerful tool that can upend a man's power in the domestic and public spheres alike. And thus, despite women's recent gains in electoral voice, the poem's speaker insists on a wife not prone to speak, a wife who presents no threat to his authority. Importantly, the speaker draws particular attention to clothes throughout the poem. He criticizes women who are of lavish of dress, asserting instead that, quote, the girl for me must wear old-fashioned modesty. Clothing is significant because it's a public representation of a woman's interior. So the speaker's call for a woman who wears old-fashioned modesty is a call for her to wear both conservative clothing and conservative virtue. The speaker states that a decoratively attired woman will grow old alone and walk upstairs and take her stockings primly sitting and mind her monkey or her kitten. These lines imply that the woman whose clothing attracts too much attention will become an old maid, essentially, undesired by virtuous men. Yet that woman is punished a step further in this poem when her sorrow is sexualized. English language feline euphemisms for female genitalia, kitten or other words, are documented as far back as the 17th century, and a similar sexualized meaning of monkey is noted to have emerged in the 19th century. So the woman who dresses provocatively is, according to this poem's paradigm, guilty from the start of licentiousness and disruption of the conventional gender norms. Thus, it is her licentious sexuality that she is left with at the end. Critic Wendy Martin has pointed out that, and I'll quote here, good citizenship and female chastity were linked in the early republic, and there is a perceived danger that female political liberty will permit general license, that female sexuality will undermine, even destroy the new republic, end quote. In this way, women's clothing, women's sexuality, and women's voting, and American politics in general, are inextricably linked. Reflecting similar anxieties about women's dress, the speaker in The Choice of a Wife exclaims that, and let me, oh, okay, yeah, we're here. He exclaims that, though blessed with millions, what are riches if I must feel she wears the breeches or breeches? Pants specifically for men, breeches are a frequent symbol of the gendered power dynamic in a marriage. For a woman to wear breeches would be a gross departure from the feminine sphere and a usurpation of the male sphere. Another threat not just to husbands, but to the American Republic in general. American women's clothing choices created palpable anxiety in the male population, and this is perhaps most obvious in a poem published in the Journal and Political Intelligencer in 1790, about 6 months before the new voting law was instituted, entitled To the Ladies. And you know what? I think, let me just double check. I think, oh, okay, we do have it. Entitled To the Ladies, its speaker tells his imagined audience of females that, quote, when women dress like boys, the attractive power is gone. Their sex forgot and all its joys when once men's clothes are on. And men's, I believe that, once our clothes are on, implying men's. This initial argument centers on the connection between clothing and a woman's visual aesthetics, essentially imposing his opinion that women who dress in men's clothing become unattractive. It is an appeal to the pathos of the female reader. But the next stanza shifts to address a male readership, warning them about women who wear men's clothes. Those who would take the marriage vow, this lesson sure it teaches, that girls in coat and waistcoats now will one day wear the breeches. The explicit connection is once again established between women's dressing habits, women's power, and men's power. The speaker warns his female readers to beware of women who do not dress conservatively or femininely enough, foretelling that those women will one day command them. Clothing aside, this serves as a warning to New Jersey readers that small extensions of leniency to women will, right now, will only contribute to an uncontrollable tide of change in the future. And then the final stanza here returns to the female reader, telling her that from nature and from beauty's line, your sex have strangely erred. Here, the, quote, absurd cross-dressing, or possibly even just transgressively dressing of women is not just damaging to aesthetics, but beauty's line, or the established social patriarchy, but also to nature itself. This strategic mention of nature invokes ideas of natural or divine law, innate truths, and religious rectitude. And it also foreshadows the emergence of a new scientific and biological discourse about women, their bodies, and their social roles. Going to come back now. And I want to say, so my research has found that New Jersey newspaper literature gradually increased in its negative attitudes toward women throughout the 1790s. And that accelerated more rapidly after the 1797 voting law made the women's franchise more uniform, resulting in significantly increased rates of voting and political engagement. The author of an 1801 letter entitled "A Few Friendly Hints to the Girls of the Present Age" discusses the coquettish behavior of the modern day, to 1801, women. He observes the change in behavior that women of the last age, who were more respected because they were more reserved, and then the, quote, flirts of the current generation who have many admirers but few lovers, and who are marked by a, quote, want of a proper reserve. His descriptions of reserve primarily regards women's behavior in the process of courting. He says, the flirts nowadays make the fellows so saucy that there is hardly to be found a respectable lover. They make themselves too cheap to keep up their consequence, without which they can never be respectable. To speak philosophically, a woman must repel before she can attract. In other words, the forward, possibly risque behavior of young women is not just frustrating to men who, as a result, treat them with contempt, quote, with contempt. The behavior is also distinctly masculine. The young women, the very same ones who as maids were allowed to vote, are not reserved and passive in their desires, but are active agents in those pursuits. In taking control of their immediate universe, young women exert a degree of power that is radically unfeminine and that reflects the gains they were simultaneously exercising in the male political sphere. In a similar vein, the author of an 1800 poem in the Sentinel of Freedom recognizes the changes in women's stations. Like others before and after him, he assigns a symbolic role to the clothes that women were wearing. Some few years ago, when stays, corsets, and bodice displayed the fine shapes of the fair belles, each female possessed the bright form of a goddess. Women of the preceding era, in other words, dressed reservedly, and thus, he explains, were, quote, guided by prudence and reason, and wives were all modest, yet lovely and gay. A clear and distinct connection is drawn between women's attire and women's behavior. Modest clothing reflects modest behavior. The speaker continues that rapid transitions in fashion have allowed folly to govern the world at her will, thereby intimately linking fashion and reason. And here it's significant that folly, or erring reason, is personified as female, emphasizing the idea that women are incapable of exercising the rational thoughts required for civic participation. The speaker concludes with an urge to modesty. He says, reflect then, ye fair ladies, on the words of the poet, whose classical talents we proudly may boast, that beauty needs no foreign patches to know it, for unadorned beauty adorned is the most. The call that he issues is for modest dress. But again, because fashion is so closely linked to behavior, it is a call for modest behavior. The titles of the literary pieces published in the New Jersey Journal in 1805 and 1806 attest to the anxieties surrounding women's equality and its feared emasculation of men. Some titles and first lines reflect the threat of women's recent gains in power, and here are a few of them. A learned lady, a great woman is not imperious, female beauty and ornament, to a languishing, ugly, talkative old maid, a celebrated female, and then others maintain the trope of the nagging wife, including a poem entitled "The Husband," an anecdote about a, quote, man plagued with an ill-tempered wife who drowns himself to be free of her, Or an epigram about a widower hoping that the rain won't resurrect his dead wife from the grave, as if she were a crop of corn. Poems like Ruined Mary and The Seduced Daughter and others about duplicitous men continue to express concerns regarding the vulnerability of America's young women. One medium-length comedic prose piece reveals the anxieties of emasculation that I attribute to the unsettling advances in women's stations. The Adventures of a Bashful Man tells of a clumsy, bookish man whose, quote, heart has failed him repeatedly when meeting with young ladies. Previous to his first visit to a gentleman and his 5 daughters, the bashful man takes dancing and bowing lessons with a professor, hoping that his new acquirements would enable him to see the ladies with tolerable intrepidity. Time after time, however, the man embarrasses himself. First, he trips while bowing, but is comforted by the ladies of the house, whose cheerfulness and familiar chat enable him to, quote, throw off his reserve and sheepishness. Then he accidentally knocks a row of fake books off a shelf and topples over an inkstand, leaving ink, quote, streaming onto the family's carpet. The tone of subtle sexual embarrassment is evident in the scene, and it becomes more pronounced when the gentleman's eldest daughter compliments the man's clothes. His nervous reaction to that results in the spilling of soup in his lap, so that, quote, for some minutes, his legs and thighs seemed stewing in a boiling cauldron. Notice also that he says that his, quote, black silk breeches were not stout enough to prevent the pain. Again, breeches. Here's a man whose breeches don't measure up. He tells that he firmly bore his pain in silence and sat with his lower extremities parboiled amidst the stifled giggling of the ladies and servants. While the protagonist is naturally a bashful person, it's the repeated embodied sexualized mistakes, together with the laughing of the women, that most upends his stability of mind. Later in this piece, or later in the meal, when addressed by another daughter, he unthinkingly places his hot food in his mouth, scalding his tongue, throat, and palate. Then, given a drink of strong brandy to cool his mouth, he panics and can't swallow. He recalls, clapping my hand over my mouth, the cursed liquor squirted through my nose and fingers like a fountain all over the dishes. I was crushed by bursts of laughter from all quarters. The laughter is primarily female in this story, and for that reason, it's significant. Each time a woman addresses the protagonist, he finds himself inferior to her, and he loses his reason and physical integrity. The 3 sexual suggestive instances of liquid streaming, squirting, or stewing in his lap result in the subtly mocking laughter of females, upsetting the hierarchy of gender dynamics in early 19th century America, and demonstrating again that women's voices and disruptive assumptions of new status were perceived as threats to individual males and to the patriarchal society of the nation as a whole. Okay, I want to conclude with one particularly provocative poem, published just a year before female suffrage was rescinded in New Jersey. It's the poem that first grabbed my attention and sort of hooked me into this project. And it made me realize that the poems that I had been reading day after day across thousands of pages of New Jersey newspapers were actually about gender anxieties and women's rights. I'd been reading through all these poems, not seeing any explicit references to the vote or anything like that. And it was this poem that made me realize that no, these have been about gender anxieties and women's rights. So without further ado, here is the poem. It's called ejaculation over the grave of my wife. And it represents the ultimate male conquest of the movement for females, of women's rights and equality. I'll read it aloud. And does this little space contain the person of my wife, who, when alive, no house could hold her tongue? Ah, what is life? What we have here is a male speaker who stands over his wife's burial site, not mourning her loss, but comedically and sexually lampooning her unrestrained speech. Not only is the speaker's wife dead, but her, quote, tongue, which no house could hold and which was too often, too loud, and too public, is forever silenced. Reversing previous poems' themes of the early 19th century female emasculating the male, this poem celebrates the male's sexuality as virile, independent, and in all ways superior to female influence. The speaker's act of, quote, ejaculation over his wife's grave is the supreme declaration of male authority. And the poem's appearance in this newspaper comes again just 1 year before New Jersey would rescind the female vote. In the early years of the Republican era, the debate over women's equality was intense between 1789 and the end of women's enfranchisement in New Jersey in 1807. The periodical literature of New Jersey demonstrates the public's various reactions to changes in women's behavior and social station. While most scholars have focused predominantly on prosaic, essayistic texts, my essay analyzes equally the creative newspaper literature that responds to shifting gender norms with anxiety. The poetry and fiction in New Jersey newspapers focused on models of female irrationality, of sexual vulnerability and licentiousness, of clothing styles and behaviors of speech. It criticized women. It sought to sway public opinion against women's rights and equality, and, reflecting the themes of control from within its lines, it imposed definitions of and limitations on women's acceptable behavior. Most importantly, the pejorative literature here was markedly more prevalent than any newspaper literature supporting women's rights. Thus, we find a clearer perspective of those 2 decades. They were not just a period of political and social gains with a clean and decisive ending. Rather, they constituted an era characterized by a prolonged struggle in which the inner anxieties and concerns of men and women across New Jersey and America were in fierce and constant tension. And I will end it there and turn it back over, I believe, to Paul.
Great, and thanks so much for that discussion. Let me